Most political strife stems from one deeply erroneous assumption. The majority of people on the political left don't just disagree with the right, they despise them. Despite never communicating or associating with them, they've concluded that they're simply hateful, evil people, and are thus deserving of all the anger and bile that the left scream at them every day. It's a profound irony that the people who preach compassion and who claim to abhor prejudice behave in this way. That they make the most unpleasant and sweeping generalisations about half the population of planet Earth. But that's entirely characteristic behaviour of a considerable slice of the political left. It's nonsense to believe that morality is so neatly divided along political lines. A childish fantasy that simplifies modern politics into the noble rebels and evil empire of Star Wars. A vision that bears no relation to nuanced reality. In fact, much of the data shows that the reverse is true. People on the right are far from the evil monsters they're painted by the left. They simply favour freedom over equality. A pipe dream that's undesirable and unattainable. Politically, there is actually a binary choice between freedom and equality. A free society will never be equal. So an equal society, by definition, cannot be free. More than this, equality is impossible. People are not equal in looks, talents, charm, intelligence, strength, health, work ethic, confidence, contacts, ambition, or any aspect that determines success or failure in the game of life. To pretend otherwise is idiocy. And as we've repeatedly seen, any attempts to oppose equality will result in slavery. Yet remarkably, the people who oppose this are the ones regarded as evil, stupid and selfish. Conservatives see no harm in ambition, in excellence, in achievement, in success. They're not driven by greed, but much of the left are fuelled by resentment. Conservatives favour liberty and personal responsibility, and they tend to look for practical solutions. That's not been lacking in compassion. They simply believe that the best way to help the needy and to cope with the challenges that we face is to strengthen the economy rather than to wreck it. It's not rocket science. The left tends to prefer moral posturing, while the right favours realistic and manageable solutions. This hardly makes them the monsters of the left's imagination. And the best way to prove that is by focusing on a case study. And who better to turn to than the father of conservatism himself, Edmund Burke. Burke, who strode like a colossus across the second half of the 18th century, was a titanic figure, and he lived in an era of political and social upheaval like few others. He was born in Dublin, but spent most of his life living in England, where he served as a Member of Parliament for close to 30 years. He failed to attain high office, but his principled positions on a number of issues, and his learned writing on history, philosophy and economics, mean he's far better remembered than many of his more illustrious peers. He was a luminously brilliant speaker and writer, one of the most eloquent politicians of history, and he was defined by principles and compassion for his entire life. Of course, none of this has saved him from our woke commissars. The committee charged with investigating statues and portraits in the Palace of Westminster has denounced him for imperial connections, which is a baffling conclusion. Burke was an opponent of slavery, and he wrote a remarkable pamphlet to that effect, though it wasn't published until after he died. But he also spent years attempting to impeach the governor of British India, Warren Hastings, for corruption. His tireless efforts on behalf of the Hindu population were those that gave him the most pride, and he also campaigned on behalf of the Irish Catholics. But for all this, Burke is most remembered for his role in the American and French revolutions. Far from having colonial links, Burke campaigned on behalf of the American rebels against the crown, just as he had done with the Indians, and he won the admiration of the radicals for doing so. As such, activists like Tom Paine expected a similar endorsement when the French Revolution broke out a few years later. Few people know it today, but the French Revolution was relatively peaceful for the first few years, and it won almost universal acclaim amongst the liberal intelligentsia. All the sort of characters who would be just as recognisable today jumped on the bandwagon. The aforementioned Tom Paine was an avid cheerleader of the French Revolution, while Richard Price, the renowned essayist, claimed every friend to man is now exulting. I have lived to see 30 millions of people, indignant and resolute, spurning at slavery and demanding liberty with an irresistible voice. Thomas Jefferson was also a huge admirer of the Revolution. He even aided Lafayette in penning their Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. Charles Edward Fox, the Whig leader, ostensibly the head of Burke's party, proclaimed how much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best. Arthur Young called it absolutely necessary to the welfare of the kingdom, and concluded that not one voice can, with reason, be raised against this assertion, while William Wordsworth penned the most emotive and enduring tribute to the French Revolution in his prelude. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And numerous liberal voices joined that chorus. All of the French progressives were ardent admirers, of course, and so were Mary Wollstonecraft, Charlotte Smith, Etta Palmdare, Olympe de Gouges, and Helen Maria Williams. All the feminists and left-leaning intellectuals you could name. All the sort of people who would now have a column in The Guardian and who would be constantly lecturing us on Twitter fell over themselves to wax lyrical about how marvellous it all was. All except one. Edmund Burke posted a lengthy rebuttal, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which predicted all the anarchy and bloodshed to come with stunning accuracy. He also foresaw that the French would execute their king 3 years before it happened, that some great general would fill the void, and that Europe would be dragged into a continent-wide conflict that would last 20 years, predicting not just the events of the French Revolution, but the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars with stunning accuracy. But how the left-wing intelligentsia howled with laughter at his idiocy. Burke's terrifying forecast was treated with sneering contempt. He was reviled, abused, and ridiculed by the liberals, who of course entertained no doubts that they knew best. The reality was that their opinions were driven by wishful thinking. But Burke had actually analysed the evidence, which is why he'd come to such differing conclusions on the French and American revolutions, where he'd also made a number of sharp predictions. Despite being a group of farmers battling against a mighty empire, Burke forecast that the Americans would win, and that the nation they created would become a beacon for freedom around the world. He saw that they already had a well-functioning system. They simply desired the liberty to run that system efficiently without paying protection money to an absent monarch. But there was no such aspiration in France. There, they sought to wreck their existing system, and they had nothing to replace it with except vague notions of liberty, optimistic sound bites with no logistical support at all. Burke, in a warning to revolutionaries everywhere, saw the folly of this at once. He compared a nation to a country estate, one we had a responsibility to hand to our descendants. We could reform it, sure. We could knock down a dilapidated section, decorate, and put up an extension or two. But to attempt to raise it and to start from scratch would be a monstrous error. Societies had evolved like nature over thousands of years. They represented the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. And to imagine that they could be built from scratch by radicals with no experience of government was a calamitous miscalculation. Burke, in his characteristic liquid eloquence, had a pithy message for such radical fools. An ignorant man who is not fool enough to meddle with his clock is, however, sufficiently confident to think he can safely take to pieces and put together at his pleasure a moral machine of another guy's importance and complexity, composed of far other wheels and springs and balances and counteracting and cooperating powers. Men little think how immorally they act in rashly meddling with what they do not understand. Their delusive good intention is no sort of excuse for their presumption. Posterity has proven Burke 100% correct. And all the radicals today who are utterly ignorant of his lessons and who arrogantly berate us would benefit much from his example. That won't happen, of course, because they're too busy screaming that we're objectionable idiots to ever read a book, just like the liberals of Burke's day screamed at him. But Burke had a pithy response for their wailing too. Because half a dozen grasshoppers under a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle, reposed beneath the shadow of the British oak, chew the cud and are silent. Pray, do not imagine that those who make the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. That's another lesson we'd all do well to remember today. As well as the lesson that the right-wingers aren't all the idiots and monsters assumed by many on the left. So why was Burke so right about everything? Well, it's not that the right lacks empathy. It's that our compassion is balanced by reason, logic and evidence. We look for practical solutions over adolescent wet dreams. To the left, this makes us unconscionable monsters. But from Robespierre on down, the real monsters have always come from the left. If you'd like to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about picking up my books. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they go into topics like this in much greater detail. They're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.